Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a really profound work by Erich Fromm. It's called To Have or To Be. We've got this fascinating stack of material from the book. And yeah, our mission today is basically to unpack its core ideas and explore why Fromm thought this whole distinction is, well, absolutely critical for our survival even.
Exactly. We're going to look at how this societal chase for having things, for possessing, has maybe led to a big promise kind of falling flat. Fromm argues that shifting towards being, focusing on experience and growth isn't just some nice philosophical idea. He sees it as an urgent necessity. And as we get into it, you might find some of these points hit surprisingly close to home for your own life, maybe, and the world now.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Fromm starts by looking at what he calls the great promise of the industrial age, this vision of, like, unlimited progress, right? Material abundance for everyone, maximum happiness, total personal freedom. We sort of imagine we become these all-powerful masters of our world, but Fromm's point is this promise, it spectacularly failed. Why does he argue that? What went wrong?
Well, it's a pretty sobering thought, isn't it? That chasing after, you know, unrestricted satisfaction of all our desires, it just hasn't actually led to well-being or happiness. Instead, from Fromm saw it creating a society full of, and this is his phrase, notoriously unhappy people, people who are lonely, anxious, depressed, destructive, dependent, and that whole idea that individual egoism, everyone just looking out for number one, would somehow magically lead to harmony and peace. He says the data just doesn't back it up. Observable facts show it leads to, well, constant class conflict and wars between nations. It really makes you stop and think, why did we ever buy into that promise in the first place?
That is the big question. And Fromm looks back historically. He points out that radical hedonism, the idea that pure pleasure is the ultimate goal, is actually pretty rare. I mean, he mentions the Greek philosopher Aristippus, maybe one of the few who really pushed it. But contrast that with the great masters of living thinkers from China, India, the Near East, Europe. They consistently made a distinction between those fleeting pleasures and real well-being, something rooted in our actual human nature. And he argues that 18th century capitalism really shifted things. Economic behavior got separated from ethics. It created this economic machine that just runs on its own rules, prioritizing growth over actual human good. And it even started pushing the idea that egotism and greed aren't, results of our circumstances, but that they're just innate human traits.
Yeah, and this whole having mindset, it even infects our relationship with nature, or maybe our contempt for nature. What's really striking here, and Fromm highlights this, is the Club of Rome reports. These super quantitative, data-heavy analyses of global problems. They ended up concluding, almost against their own methods, you could say, that the only way to avoid global catastrophe is through fundamental changes in the values and attitudes of man. Basically, a new ethic, a new way of relating to nature. It's kind of amazing, right? That hard data leads back to something so human, so qualitative. It just underlines how urgent this shift Fromm's talking about really is.
Okay, and this next point he makes, it really stopped me in my tracks. He suggests we might have a kind of bending of our survival instinct. Like, we actually prefer the idea of a future catastrophe over making sacrifices now. He tells that story about Arthur Koestler during the Spanish Civil War. Koestler basically risked getting shot rather than leave a warm, comfortable villa to go out into the cold, rainy night. It's chilling. How does Fromm directly link that kind of unsettling observation back to his main ideas of having and being?
It's a really crucial link. To really get Fromm's argument, you have to grasp the deep difference he sees between the having mode and the being mode of existence. Now, common sense might tell us, well, you need to have things to live, to enjoy life. And that's true, up to a point. But these masters of living that Fromm talks about, figures like the Buddha, Jesus, Master Eckhart, even the real Marx, as Fromm saw him, focusing on his core humanistic ideas, they all centered their teachings on the alternative. They taught that real human growth, real fulfillment, comes not from craving possessions, not from having much, but from being much, from developing yourself.
Okay, let's try and make that more concrete. He uses this wonderful illustration comparing two poems about a flower. There's Tennyson's Flower in a Crannied Wall. Tennyson sees the flower, and what does he do? He plucks it out, roots and all, so he can understand it.
Yeah.
It's an act of having knowledge, right? But it kills the very thing he wants to understand.
Exactly. It destroys the object. Now contrast that with Basho's haiku. When I look carefully, I see the Nizuna blooming by the hedge. Basho just looks. Carefully, he's being at one with the flower, experiencing it, letting it live. It's a totally different way of knowing.
And Fromm puts Goethe somewhere in between with his poem Found.
Yeah, Goethe feels that same impulse, the urge to pluck the flower.
Right, but he resists it.
He resists. And instead, he digs it up carefully and replants it with all its roots back in his garden. For Goethe, Fromm says, the force of life is stronger than the force of mere intellectual curiosity. And the point isn't just some East versus West thing. It's about societies centered on people versus societies centered on things, on possessions.
So how does this difference, having versus being, actually show up in our everyday lives? Let's break it down. How about learning? In the having mode, Fromm says students are kind of passive. They just memorize notes, cram for exams. They're storing these fixed ideas, these thought objects, but not really internalizing them, not letting them change anything inside.
Right. It's about passing the tests, acquiring the grade, having the diploma. But in the being mode, students come to a lecture, maybe already thinking, with questions. They listen actively, they engage, they argue, they're stimulated. The whole experience changes them, helps them grow. It's not just adding facts to a pile.
And that connects directly to remembering, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The having mode of memory is mechanical. It relies on external aids like notes. He makes these interesting observations, like sales clerks using machines for simple math they could easily do in their heads, or students who write everything down. Sometimes they actually remember less because they're not processing it internally. And musicians who are great sight readers but struggle to play from memory without the score.
He even mentioned people in Mexico who couldn't read or write, often having superior memories.
Yeah, because they had to rely on internal recall. He even says about himself, my memory bank had become an externalized part of me in the form of my notes. So, true remembering in the being mode is an active internal process, not just external storage.
And you see that same mechanical approach in conversation and reading sometimes, right? The having way.
Totally. You prepare things to say to impress people. You display your knowledge like goods in a shop window. That's having.
Or reading just to get the plot, or collect information.
Like Fromm's well-informed guide at a museum who knows all the facts but doesn't really engage or question.
Whereas reading in the being mode.
That's about inner participation. You argue with the author in your head, you question things, you let it spark insights about yourself, about human nature. It's a dialogue. It changes you.
Okay, what about authority? This is a really sharp distinction he makes.
Very sharp. There's having authority, which is just based on position or power. Think of a king. His competence doesn't really matter. He just has the authority. Or maybe a politician elected just because they look good on TV. The external sign, the uniform, the title replaces actual competence.
And how is that maintained?
Fromm argues it's maintained by dulling people's critical thinking, making them believe the fiction of that authority. Now, contrast that with being an authority. This comes from real competence, real skill, real knowledge. And someone who is an authority doesn't need to dominate. They actually help others grow. It's emulating, not controlling.
That leads neatly into the difference between having knowledge and knowing. They sound similar, but Fromm sees them as worlds apart.
Completely. Having knowledge is just possessing information, facts, data points you can pull out and show off. But knowing, in the being mode, is an active dynamic process. It's about penetrating surfaces, getting to the root of things, seeing reality, shattering illusions.
He mentions the Hebrew word jadoa.
Yes, jadoa, which means both to know and to love. It implies this deep, almost creative penetration, and he puts figures like Buddha, the Hebrew prophets, Jesus, Master Eckhart, even Freud in this category, people dedicated to liberating others from illusions, knowing as liberation.
And faith. How does that fit into the having being modes?
Well, in the having mode, faith can become like possessing an idol or clinging to a set of beliefs as a crutch for certainty. You have faith like you have property. He even uses that provocative line, Christ does all the loving for us, meaning it becomes externalized, something we rely on rather than cultivate within.
Okay, so what's faith in the being mode?
In the being mode, faith is an active inner orientation, a process of self-creation. It's experiencing those divine qualities, love, reason, justice within yourself. It's based on your own experience, your inner conviction, not just accepting dogma. It's something you are, not something you have.
Okay, this next one, loving, from Insom's analysis here is, well, that's pretty intense.
It really is. In the having mode, love becomes about confining, possessing, controlling the other person, turning love into a thing.
He had that question, how many parents love their children, is still an entirely open question. That's wow.
It's stark, isn't it? And he talks about marriages starting with love, but transforming into this kind of friendly ownership, possessing each other.
So the alternative, loving in the being mode.
That's completely different. It's a productive activity. It's about caring, knowing the other person, deeply responding to them, affirming them, actively enjoying their growth and aliveness. It's giving, sharing, stimulating. It's a verb, an action, not a possession.
And finally, consuming. This seems central to the having mode in our kind of society.
Oh, absolutely. Fromm calls it perhaps the most important form of having in wealthy industrial societies. We consume things, cars, clothes, gadgets, experiences, even partly to relieve anxiety, to fill a void. But the relief is temporary, so we need more and more. It becomes a cycle.
And he has that formula.
Yeah, I am what I have and what I consume. Our identity gets fundamentally wrapped up in our possessions and our consumption patterns. It defines who we feel we are.
So yeah, consumption really seems to define the having mode, especially now. But Fromm did see a flicker of hope, didn't he? Especially with the younger generation back in the late 60s.
He did. He observed this growing attitude among some young people who weren't focused on acquiring stuff. They were finding genuine joy in doing what one likes to do without expecting anything lasting in return, like playing music together, exploring ideas.
They were searching to be themselves instead of having and consuming.
Exactly. Now, he acknowledged that for some, it ended in disappointment or disillusionment. But he still saw this minority as historically significant, a sign of a potential new trend.
And he connects this to other movements, too.
Yeah, he suggests that the big social revolutions of the 20th century, women's liberation, changes in attitudes towards children, the sexual revolution, even though they were still developing, were fundamentally victorious revolutions because they had already started changing consciousness, challenging those old power structures tied to having.
Okay, so let's zoom out again. How does this link to changing people? Fromm argues character isn't fixed.
Yeah, right. That was a big break from some older psychoanalytic ideas that your character gets locked in early childhood. Fromm believed most people are a mix of having and being tendencies, and crucially, our environment, our society, plays a huge role in which side gets nurtured.
So change is possible.
Yes. And the being mode, he says, actually grows the more you practice it, like exercising a muscle. He has that line. What is spent is not lost, but on the contrary, what is kept is lost. Meaning, when you give your energy, your love, your attention, when you are active, you grow. Hoarding it, keeping it, leads to stagnation.
And this fundamental difference shapes how we relate to each other, too. Let's talk about solidarity versus antagonism.
In the having mode, if your sense of self is based on what you possess, then everyone else is a potential threat, a competitor. You need to protect what you have, get more, compare yourself to others. Greed, Fromm says, has no natural stopping point.
You can always have more.
Right. So it leads to constant struggle, fear, antagonism between individuals, between groups, between nations. He sees it as a root cause of war.
In the being mode.
The being mode is totally different. Sharing doesn't diminish what you have. It enhances the experience. Think about sharing joy, or ideas, or love. It deepens connection. It fosters solidarity without crushing individuality.
Okay, what about joy versus pleasure or thrill? We often chase thrills, excitement.
We do. But Fromm argues those intense pleasures of radical hedonism or the temporary thrill of buying something new, they don't lead to lasting joy. He says they often lead to a kind of underlying sadness, a need for the next thrill, because the vessel has not grown. You haven't actually developed internally.
So what is joy, then, for Fromm?
Joy comes from the process of becoming more fully yourself, growing nearer to the goal of becoming ourself, as he puts it. It's tied to productive activity, to growth, to connection. He links it to things like the Buddhist path or even the Jewish idea of Shabbat, a day dedicated purely to being, not doing, or having.
Let's touch on sin and forgiveness. The conventional view is often about breaking rules, feeling guilty, needing punishment.
Right, tied to an external authority. But Fromm offers a different perspective, a non-authoritarian one. He quotes Thomas Aquinas, saying, God can never be insulted by us except we act against our own well-being.
So sin isn't about offending God, but harming ourselves?
Essentially, yes, harming our own potential for growth and well-being. He even reinterprets the story of Adam and Eve in Eden. He sees their sin not primarily as disobedience, but as the sin of separateness, cutting themselves off from harmony, from each other, from nature.
And the solution isn't punishment.
No, the solution, the healing, comes through love, through connection. He points out that atonement literally means at-one-ment, becoming whole, becoming connected again.
And how does this relate to the fear of dying? That seems pretty fundamental.
It is. In the having mode, if your security, your identity is all tied up in what you possess, your property, your status, even your own body considered as a possession, then death is the ultimate threat.
The ultimate law.
The ultimate loss of everything you have. So the fear is intense and unavoidable.
But in the being mode,
If your life is focused on the process of living, of growing, of connecting, then you aren't clinging to life as a possession. The fear of losing it diminishes, he quotes Spinoza. The wise think about life, not about death, because their focus is on the quality of living right now. Security comes from within, from the richness of their being.
Which brings us to time. The having mode seems really bound by past and future.
Absolutely. It's focused on past accomplishments or acquisitions. I am what I was, or I am what I have. And it's constantly looking to the future. What will I acquire next? How will I secure my future possessions?
But being happens.
Being happens in the here and now. That moment of creative insight, the experience of deep love, the feeling of joy, grasping a truth. Fromm says these occur outside of clock time. He calls this eternity, not meaning endless time, but timelessness, a moment of pure presence.
So we shouldn't ignore time completely.
No, he says our physical existence obviously happens in time, and we need to respect that, plan, remember. But we shouldn't let time, the past and future, rule us, shouldn't let it crowd out the possibility of experiencing life fully in the present.
Okay, so Fromm paints this picture. The having mode leads to, frankly, sick individuals and a sick society. So what's the alternative? What would a new man and a new society actually look like?
Well, crucially, Fromm argues that you can't have one without the other. Social change and character change have to happen together. They're interdependent.
So just changing the system isn't enough.
Right. He critiques the idea that just changing the economic or political structure will automatically change people. He uses the French and Russian revolutions as examples where, because the character of the leaders and many people hadn't fundamentally changed, they ended up recreating versions of the old oppressive systems.
So we need an inner shift alongside the outer shift.
Exactly. A fundamental shift in our values, our motivations, our character structure.
Now, he makes this really provocative claim about Western society and Christianity. He says we were never really Christianized at heart. Some might argue, though, that things like charity, community focus, those seem very much in the being mode. How does Fromm address that?
That's a fair point. Fromm defines religion very broadly, not just traditional faiths, but any shared system of thought and action that gives people a framework for understanding the world and an object of devotion. And he argues that while Western society adopted Christian beliefs on the surface, our actual operative religion, the one that really drives behavior, remained rooted in what he calls the pagan hero ideal, meaning conquest, dominance, pride, accumulating wealth and power. He thinks Christian ideals like love, humility, sharing often became an alienated cover, something we profess but don't deeply live by, like having Christ do all the loving for us externally rather than it being our own inner orientation. It's a challenging critique of how values can be professed but not practiced.
And this ties into what he calls the marketing character, which he saw as dominant in contemporary society.
Yes. This is a really key concept for understanding our times, according to Fromm. In a market-driven society, success increasingly depends on selling oneself. You have to package yourself, make yourself desirable, adaptable, fit the demands of the market, whether it's the job market, the social market, whatever.
So your value is external.
Your value becomes your exchange value. This marketing character, Fromm says, neither loves nor hates deeply. They don't have strong attachments either to themselves or others because they need to be constantly ready to change, to adapt, to become whatever is currently in demand.
No real core self.
Exactly. There's no solid core, just this constant adaptation. And Fromm suggests this might explain a puzzling phenomenon. Our widespread indifference to existential threats like nuclear war or ecological collapse, even when we know the facts. There's a kind of emotional detachment that comes with the marketing orientation.
Okay, so if we need this deep change, how does it happen? Fromm outlines some conditions.
Yeah, and they're remarkably similar, he points out, to frameworks found in Buddhism, like the Four Noble Truths, and even in Marx's ideas about achieving liberation. It starts with 1, becoming aware that we are suffering, that things aren't right. 2, recognizing the cause of the suffering in this case, the having mode, and the societal structures that promote it. 3, knowing that there is a way to overcome the suffering, the possibility of shifting to the being mode. And 4, accepting that this requires adopting new norms for living, new practices.
But just knowing isn't enough.
Absolutely not. He stresses, insight separated from practice remains ineffective. You can understand intellectually why you're unhappy or why society is dysfunctional, but unless you act differently, unless you practice being, nothing fundamentally changes. It takes conscious effort and action.
So what would this new society designed to foster this new man actually look like? What are some concrete features Fromm suggests?
Well, the overarching goal is to create conditions where people can choose to fully be, where they feel secure enough to give up the crutch of having, where security comes from solidarity, connection, and inner richness, not possessions.
That sounds good, but how? It seems like a huge challenge.
It is. And Fromm acknowledges the complexity. He calls for a new humanistic science of man to tackle these really tricky problems, like how do you maintain industrial production without crushing people under total centralization? How do you combine necessary planning with genuine decentralization and participation? And crucially, how do you motivate people with psychological satisfactions, meaning joy in work, community, contribution, rather than just material rewards? It requires rethinking our whole economic and social logic.
So some specific economic changes he proposes.
One big one is directing production towards what he calls sane consumption, not just producing whatever sells or makes a profit, because consumer desires are often manufactured by advertising.
Right, we're told what we should want.
Exactly. So production should serve genuine human needs and well-being. And he suggests a radical tool for citizens: consumer strikes. He argues that if even, say, 20% of consumers collectively decided to stop buying cars for a period, it could force the whole system to change. That, for him, would be an act of real, genuine democracy, people directly shaping the economy.
And democracy itself needs rethinking.
Definitely. He calls for full participatory democracy, both in industry and politics, moving beyond just voting every few years, which he sees as often being passive spectator democracy.
So more active involvement.
Much more. He envisions creating maybe hundreds of thousands of face-to-face groups across the country where people could actually discuss issues, get information, and deliberate meaningfully. He uses the analogy of juries. When ordinary people are given full information and real responsibility, they tend to make much wiser decisions than you'd guess from uninformed opinion polls.
And this requires decentralization.
Maximum decentralization, yes. And replacing bureaucratic management, which treats people like pawns in a machine and worships rules. Think of his Eichmann example again, with humanistic management that centers human well-being and growth.
Wow. Okay, what else? His suggestions are quite sweeping.
They are. He advocates prohibiting brainwashing methods in industrial and political advertising. He considers manipulative advertising a serious threat to mental health, inducing a kind of semi-hypnotic state.
And the guaranteed income idea.
Yes, a guaranteed yearly income for everyone. This ensures the basic right to live unconditionally, whether you have a traditional job or not. He argues it would actually cost less than the complex, often inefficient welfare systems we have now, and it would provide genuine freedom and security, freeing people up from the constant economic anxiety that fuels the having mode.
And he sees women's liberation as absolutely key.
Absolutely crucial. He views the liberation of women from patriarchal domination as a fundamental challenge to the entire power structure of the having society. He calls the downfall of men's supremacy one of the most revolutionary developments of the 20th century, precisely because it undermines that core principle of domination.
And connected to that.
Connected to that is liberation from sexual guilt. When sex is no longer laden with guilt used for social control, it ceases to be a tool for forcing submission and becomes part of human self-expression.
He also talks about information, the media.
Yes, the need for effective dissemination of effective information. He argues that current news media, often driven by profit and the need for sensationalism, frequently misinform or provide only superficial coverage, so citizens can't make truly informed decisions. His proposal, a kind of supreme cultural council composed of respected, impartial figures, their job wouldn't be censorship, but the opposite, ensuring all relevant facts, diverse perspectives, including minority opinions, are made available to the public to create the basis for real, informed public discourse.
Okay, Fromm lays out this incredibly detailed, radical vision for change. But he himself acknowledges the chances are
slim. He's realistic about the scale of the challenge, but he insists that clinging to the current path, the realism of today's leaders, is actually less realistic because it's leading towards catastrophe. Our only hope, he argues, lies in the energizing attraction of a new vision. A vision of a different way to live that can actually inspire people to make the necessary changes.
So the utopian goal is actually the practical one.
In a sense, yes, because the current practical path is unsustainable. The shift from having to being isn't about flipping a switch overnight. It's about changing direction, tipping of the scales. And he adds an interesting thought. Maybe the modern marketing character, because they lack deep roots and fixed attachments, might paradoxically be easier to change than the old-style hoarding character who is rigidly attached to their possessions and beliefs.
Then who does he think this vision might appeal to?
He believes it cuts across traditional political lines, left, right, center. It appeals to anyone who cares, people who care about life, about humanity, about the future. He says people today are yearning for human beings who have wisdom and convictions and the courage to act according to their convictions. They're looking for authenticity, for leaders who embody being, not just having power. So, wrapping this all up, what does it mean for you listening to this? Fromm ends his book with this powerful image, the possibility of building a city of being. He envisions it as a new synthesis, combining the spiritual depth and human focus he saw in the best of the late medieval world with the scientific rationality and progress that came with the Renaissance. It's offered as an alternative to the path we're on, which he compares to the Tower of Babel, this grand project of unlimited material progress that, he argues, is inevitably collapsing under its own weight.
So the challenge Fromm leaves us with, both as individuals and, collectively as a society, isn't just about how to survive. It's about how to truly live. It's about fundamentally shifting our deepest motivations, moving away from a life centered on profit, power, having more, towards one centered on being, sharing, understanding, connecting. Maybe take a moment to consider, what parts of your own life run mainly on the having track? What might change, even in small ways, if you consciously leaned more into being? What could it mean for you to feel less defined by what you own or consume, and more defined by who you are and how you engage with the world?
We really hope this deep dive into Erich Fromm's To Have or To Be has sparked some thoughts, given you some profound new perspectives to maybe chew on. Until next time, keep exploring these ideas, keep questioning, and keep trying to see that difference, the difference between what you merely have and who you truly are.